Okay. Hello, hi, it's Margaret Ross, Chair for the Hampshire Branch. Just to welcome you to this webinar. One of the things that we've got just before we get going is that if you've got any comments or questions you want to ask, could you type them into the question area? What I'll do is gather them up, and at the end of Michael's presentation, we'll deal with all the questions then, because we're going to record as we go through, and it makes it actually more useful for people to see it afterwards. But the one thing I'm really interested in, there's a number of you already on there. Is there anybody from any countries outside the UK? And if so, in the question box, could you just type in the name of the country that you're in? Have we got anybody from outside the UK? In which case, in the question area, could you just type in just the name of the country? We found that when we ran the webinar 2 weeks ago, we ended up from somebody from Sri Lanka, someone from Mauritius, and someone from Saudi Arabia. So I'm wondering if we've got anybody equally far afield tonight. In which case, could you type in possibly into the question area which city you're closest to in the UK? This actually reassures me that there's somebody out there and you can hear. No messages. Ah, yes, I have. Warwick. Great. Okay. Coventry. Yes. Tunbridge Wells. Yes. Bournemouth. Great. That's where I am. Anyone from anywhere else? I think we've got at least about another. Worthing. Great. We're getting a very nice spread geographically. Anyone from London? No? Anyone from Scotland? Wales?
I'm in London.
London? Oh, that's good. One of the parts that we're very keen to do are still in Birmingham. That sounds good. So we're getting a nice geographic spread, which is fabulous. And one of the things would be lovely for Michael to go around and give this presentation in all the branches, but I think we're all in the situation where that's not possible at all. So hopefully it all works well, and it's almost the same as having Michael with us. One of the areas within this webinars is actually this opportunity for people to actually participate a little bit more. So don't forget, if you've got any questions or points you want to raise, if you put in the question area, and I'll sort of monitor that as we go through and raise all your questions at the end. This is due to last to probably, we're starting at 5:30 and we should be finishing a bit before 7. So there will be time for a bit of questions. So anybody else like to say, anyone else coming from somewhere else? No, maybe not. One of the things to watch out for the webinars, if you go to the events section of the BCS and then onto the first section within the events, you've got a list of all of the different webinars that are coming on. So you can actually go for geographic area, or you could go for the dates, etc. So this is a very useful facilities. Very shortly, we've got Michael. Would you like to say hello, Michael?
Hello to you all. Delighted you're there. I'm so relieved that somebody's going to listen in.
Well, it's nice that we've got a geographic spread.
Yeah, that's great. I'm still secretly hoping somebody from Sri Lanka might come on as well.
I noticed that Bob Harvey's, you've come on, but you're going to type in your location if you're coming in, with very much for the Surrey group. I know that it was also advertised with the Hampshire branch, the Dorset branch, and Central London and Coventry.
I should have been in Coventry last night, so I'm thrilled that there's somebody here tonight.
Ah, I'm here from the Dorset branch, has just come up. Great, welcome. So hopefully we can get some from the other branches as well, and also some of the other specialist groups. Because what Michael Grant's going to be talking about is very much of interest to all of you, regardless of where you're geographically positioned, and also where you actually your particular specialist group interests are. Now that's at the Dorset one. At the moment, our attendees, we have 15 so far. So hopefully some more. I'm particularly keen if we can get some more from overseas, because it's very difficult to make contact with the current and past BCS presidents, particularly when you're quite a long way away from London, which is when most of the a lot of the activities are. One of the things that you might want to put, not so much of the more general questions, is anything that you particularly like, maybe Michael, to give a talk about in the future, as a sort of maybe some follow-up ones, because there's one or two.
This sounds like a setup.
I know. Well, I thought while you're online, you can't object, you see.
Oh, you'd be surprised.
Kick me under the table, you see, to shut up. But Michael is such an excellent presenter that we've got, and he's got a wealth of experience. So there's lots of possibilities there for follow-up webinars. I can definitely see them.
But please don't anybody ask me on some subject. I ended up in Sri Lanka having to do a keynote speech on data analytics, and I have to be honest with you, I couldn't have written what I knew on the back of a postage stamp. But fortunately, BCS and marketing helped me out a bit. So I don't want any of these way out stuff that I have no idea on. Please, please.
Well, I think we're at a very exciting time within the BCS, really, aren't we? Because suddenly, in this last 10 years, everything has moved forward so much with computers, and certainly they've very much come into their own with this rather horrendous time that we're on at the moment. So I mean, without the internet, I'm not so sure what the shutdown would have been like for so many people.
You know, I've spent so many years worrying about the fact that IT hasn't looked good for society when big projects have gone wrong and so on. And this, for me, is the first time in my life where I really, really feel that everybody, whoever you are, whatever age you are, wherever you are, that IT and technology is our savior at the moment. And that's a wonderful thing. I mean, there aren't too many wonderful things going on at the moment, but that is something which I hope will remain with people, and they'll remember that forever.
And I mean, when you think about all the schools, suddenly they're all learning remotely. I mean, in the past, you would think maybe in Australia, when they were talking about their way of communicating with, in the past, with all the stations with the youngsters, then suddenly we've actually got this for real, and not only in the UK but worldwide.
But mind you, so some of the kids in one of my schools are not too keen on this, because they were having to go in to school every day during the Easter holidays, because of course their parents were key workers. So it's not all good in the kids' view, but I think it's a wonderful opportunity to keep them going.
Absolutely. And there's so much actual work going on where so many people are using IT to help. Certainly within the Hampshire area, we found out that there's groups busy making the masks and for the key workers, and they're using their 3D printers, going around sort of saying, anybody else got any materials to actually use as raw materials for 3D printers. So there's all sorts of things going on. I think that, Michael, you were saying that your daughter is particularly, just mentioning,
Yes.
can I mention something about Victoria?
Yes, sure.
Michael's daughter, Victoria, is amazing. If you actually do a search on Victoria Grant, she's a fantastic hat designer, and you'll actually have seen her hats at the last royal wedding. Also, Madonna's wearing them. They are beautiful, but during all this problems, she and a lot of her friends are also top milliners, have actually changed their work areas completely, and they're producing masks.
Yeah, Victoria, she completed her 200th mask this evening, and every single milliner in the country is joining in and using their sort of sewing skills, I guess. And each day she has to rush across on her bike from Notting Hill down to St James to pick up more material and then carry it back on her bike and get working. But I'm so proud of her, and I'm so proud of so many different stratas and people in society who are really doing some fantastic things and pulling together. Thank goodness.
It's amazing. Everybody is really helping each other out so much more. And notice that people are sort of smiling at each other much more and sort of saying good morning or good afternoon again, where they probably would have just looked at a stranger and just walked on straight past. So, and even it's a waving from windows to each other. So even if you can't go out, you're communicating the way that you weren't in the past. But IT particularly is fantastically useful. Now, could I ask anybody else from any other parts of the UK? If so, please send a message in the question area. We can pick it up. And also, if there's anybody particularly from overseas, please just send in the questionnaire just the name of the country that you're from. That would be fantastic. I think at this stage we're beginning to get prepared. So at this stage, could I just mention that we are very, very lucky to have Michael Grant to do this webinar for us. Hi, I've got a message. Hi, I'm in Milton Keynes. Thank you, Matt. That's great. Anybody else out there that we haven't heard from yet? It's very reassuring to know that the question system's working. We've got such a lovely spread. This is going to be recorded, and the recording will start when Michael starts talking. So again, if anybody missed it or want to go through, or you want to possibly replay it across to your branches or SGs, then this is a great opportunity. As I said, we're very, very lucky to have Michael Grant. He has a spectacular career, and we're very lucky within the BCS to have him. He's been a marvellous president through his years, and with a trotting around the world as well. I've got another message. I can't quite reach the first part of it from somebody. Right. There's a message that's come up that says how to make your own mask. Fantastic. So I'm just going to read that out. https://makermask makermask.org/shows SHOWS. So anyone that hasn't got a mask, which we haven't, we couldn't buy any, https://makermask.org/shows plural SHOWS. Thank you very much. I think that's a very useful. Thank you, John. That's a very handy one. Useful information to send. Thank you. At that stage, I think we're getting to the start time, and I think again it's Michael. You ready to?
Yeah, ready to fire when you are.
Okay. And Joe, you okay?
All right, so off we go. Well, hello everyone, and a very happy St George's Day. Thanks so much for sort of joining me today in these very challenging times, and I hope that my career story and my golly, more than a few lessons learned, will perhaps prove an interesting distraction for you, and perhaps even some amusement, usually at my expense. I'm tremendously grateful. Thanks very much to Professor Margaret Ross for enabling us to bring together members from several BCS branches. I've got a feeling that this is something that will carry on in the future when we're all back to normal. And of course, a welcome to anybody else who is dropping in or happens to drop in at any stage. This is going to be a bit different from most BCS meetings, and for me, it's going to be more than a little bit like stepping into the confession box. Over the next 60 minutes, I'd really like to take you through my career journey of working with 6 major IT supplier corporations and also my world of volunteering. As my children love to remind me, none of these companies exist today. And of course, having explained to them there are things like mergers and takeovers and failures, I love to remind them that the secret, of course, is to know when to join a company, but much, much more importantly, when to leave. So I hope that you'll enjoy the anecdotes. You'll certainly get a little view of the turbulence of the IT industry over my career, and a glimpse of some of the amazing people that I've been so lucky enough to meet with and to work with. And you'll probably have an amusing time watching me grow up. But perhaps above all, I hope that some of the lessons and the mistakes that I've made will be there for you to find out and maybe avoid doing in your own lives in the future. I must admit, my start in my life was perhaps not perfect. My dad actually was Australian born and was an RAF corporal who'd served in Burma and India, but very sadly and rather tragically died in service of the RAF just after the end of the war, and I was about 6 months old. My mum was widowed, obviously, and I spent a lot of my childhood living in my grandmother's council house in Dartford in Kent. And you can see a little family gathering there outside her home. And life was, pretty tough. And I don't mention this for anybody's sympathy, but purely to illustrate the fact that rather recently emerged from some of the BCS research. Did you know that the IT profession enables social mobility greater than any other single profession in the UK? And I hope that over the next few minutes, I can perhaps illustrate that to you through my own career. Well, life took a pretty dramatic turn for me when I was about 7.5 years old, and a charity called the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund sent me off to an English cathedral boarding school. It was in Rochester. I think it was the second oldest school in the world, 604 AD. And it was kind of, if I'm honest, it was the embodiment of Tom Brown's school days for those first 5 years, although thank goodness the next 5 years made up for it. I often sought refuge in my school tuck shop in those first 5 years, whilst it was toughening me up for the real world. Of course, I guess really, I suppose I'd become a child of charity, and I left it with a huge social conscience. And I felt, kind of a responsibility to pay back into society as a volunteer. And it also taught me just how incredibly important education is for every single child, and how my education was going to massively influence my life in future years. And this is something that you'll find I feel so strongly about. And the BCS, of course, is doing such wonderful work in this education area as well. I didn't actually go to university. I joined a company called H.J. Heinz. Yes, you got it, the beans means people. Our financial circumstances wouldn't have allowed me to go away to university with all the travel and the sort of off-home stuff. So I joined Heinz as what they used to call in those days a management trainee. I guess really the modern equivalent of that would be taking an apprenticeship degree. My first boss was actually an extraordinary guy, Tony O'Reilly, who taught me a lot. He was an Irish rugby player, and he actually went on to run the whole world of Heinz out of the Pittsburgh headquarters in the US. So, as you can imagine, I have a great pride in what I consider to be the remarkable work of the BCS in supporting and driving all of those digital apprenticeships. I guess my strong social conscience really kicked in about now as well, because I sort of left school, and I ended up running my little local youth club at weekends. And then I joined the Reserve Army, or the Territorial Army, as it was called in those days. My wife loves this. She's never seen me actually do anything quite as hard work as this in my entire life. But I joined the Territorial Army at the age of 19. Unbeknown to me, a rather lucky regiment took me on, called the Honourable Artillery Company, based up in the city, which happened, strangely enough, to be the second oldest regiment in the world, going right back to 1537. Anyway, I felt it was good for me to do my bit for Queen and Country, and by luck, and I must say absolutely no planning at all, it helped me soon to enter the technology field. I think the first thing that when I joined as a reserve, the first thing that ever happened to me was a company sergeant major came up to me and screamed in my ear, "Never volunteer." What a load of bunkum that was. I went on to be a young reserve officer in that regiment, and how volunteering absolutely changed and really inspired my whole future and my career path, as indeed, of course, it can for every single one of us. Life took another rather unexpected turn when I was 21. They said that my mother died of a broken heart. Actually, she committed suicide. And that, of course, was one heck of a shock to my system at that relatively early age. And I knew I'd got to do something to sort of get it out of my system and recover. I resigned from Heinz, and I sought to recover by traveling overland round the world. This was pretty mad because in those days, absolutely nobody did this, other than perhaps draft dodgers from the Vietnam War, or the Kiwis and the Aussies trying to get back home. Yes, I'm afraid I have to admit that is me wearing those rather strange red pajamas. I'd had to sell my clothes at this stage in order to buy food, because of course, obviously I had very little money as an apprentice, but I had enough to buy, can you believe, a bus ticket from, I think it was Richmond Station on Southwest trains all the way to Delhi, where I had the most amazing time living off my wits and having an incredible, exciting time. This may not have looked the most luxurious thing, but believe you me, it was far better than the local transport in many of the countries. I hugely enjoyed the cultures, the people, and of course I spent time in some fantastic places. I was probably one of the first people ever to go to Turkey. There wasn't a single hotel on that southern coast, and it was definitely not a holiday destination in those days. I even got to get into Iran. This picture, sadly, got me arrested in Tehran. It's a picture of a family actually doing their domestic washing up in a drain at the side of a road. I soon learned you do not photograph people in their religious clothes in those days. Anyway, I also discovered Afghanistan, which was just amazing, even before the Russians, I think, probably knew where it was, and of course, before ISIS turned it upside down. I got eventually to walk in my pajamas over the Khyber Pass. Do you know, I can't believe they let me into Australia wearing that stuff. And I worked in Australia on farms to earn my passage back, and taking some pretty boring admin jobs in that wonderful city of Perth in Western Australia, in order that I could earn enough money to get back to the UK, which I eventually did on a ship. Well, a sort of ship. It was actually on its way to a breaker's yard up in the north of England. But it came back via New Zealand and Tahiti, Panama, Venezuela. It did have one slight drawback. I found I was sharing a cabin with 5 other people that I'd never met in my life, and that in fact there was no porthole, and we were some probably probably over exaggerating this, 18 inches above the prop shaft. So I spent most of my time happily up on the deck. But all this left me with a passion for having an international career. And so I set my sights on my first real job in technology. Now, I wonder how many of you can remember the first person who gave you a decent break in your career. Oh, I remember mine. Here he is, Harry Hall, standing up there on the right-hand side. He was the personnel manager of an amazing company called Redifon Flight Simulation. It was a multi-million pound engineering and IT genius company, and it was selling flight simulators to the world's airlines and military. And by great luck and no planning, once again, I was lucky enough to rise from being a personnel recruitment junior to a marketing manager over the next 6 years. This place was a STEM dream. The products were kind of a combination, if you like, between sort of 6-axis motion systems to early CGI, computer-generated image systems, digital sound and systems. And it was all, in those days, driven by about 10 PDP-11s from digital. I wonder how many people listening can remember those early things. My job actually was to develop, if you like, the promotional items. So I did all the brochures, I set up their exhibitions, and I did a lot of public relations work for them with the international aviation press and technical press. And this company, so incredibly lucky I was, gave me enough rope either to hang myself or to make my career. Even as a very young man, I got to host a guy here, Senator Barry Goldwater. In those days, he was a very hawkish US defense minister. And I got to work again in my 20s, really, with delegations from China and Russia. To my immense surprise, I got given the job of going on the original AWACS launch. That was the Advanced Warning Aircraft. It was a 707 with a big sort of mushroom on the top. And I was able to fly this with the international press down from Boeing Field up in Seattle to Tinker Air Force Base, where they allowed me to do the launch for them. In those days, this aeroplane was probably only had about a third of the flight deck was filled out with IT systems. But even then, you could actually see every single aircraft that was flying in 6 states at one time. Nowadays, of course, I'm sure it's incredibly different with and actually stacked out with the most amazing kit. This really brought me the opportunity to have my first visits to the United States. And we partnered with a company called the Evans and Sutherland Computer Corporation in Salt Lake City. They were really the world leaders in those early CGI systems, which, of course, I hasten to add, people were paying millions of pounds for in those days, and which you could now get on the cheapest $59 game that any child runs. What a long way that whole CGI stuff has gone. As again, a young man, I was so lucky that they gave me a role of lobbying a Pentagon general, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and he enjoyed the Cuban cigars that I used to smuggle in for him. And I worked a lot with senators in the defense area for America. And I guess really it kind of began my love affair with the US, of which I'm still a very keen ambassador. Well, eventually it was time for me to move on after 6 years from Redifon. I hadn't really actually intended to join a computer company. And if the truth be known, I saw an advert and I felt, oh gosh, I haven't been for an interview for 6 years. I'll pop along to this one and get some practice. Wow, well, did that teach me a lesson? If you take a chance in life, you never know, or you could never humanly guess what might come out of it at the end. The job actually was quite a bit less money, but the people were just fantastic. I was eventually bamboozled into joining this US-based young startup company. I didn't know when I joined it, of course, that they were the blue-eyed boys of the New York Stock Exchange, and they were really some of the very earliest players into the super mini market. And for the second time in my life, I found that I joined an amazing company. And you know, I try to say to a lot of young people, if you don't move around in your early career, you'll probably never know what you most enjoy doing. And of course, if you enjoy doing a job with something, or in a particular profession or industry, you stand a jolly good chance of being successful. Well, very topically, I ran my first kickoff meeting with a gentleman here that some of you may recognize. Yes, the only recently late Sir Stirling Moss. This was a kickoff with about 500 people from Prime Computer across Europe, and I had Stirling as my guest speaker. Those of you that are as old in the tooth as I am just might even remember that wonderful ad where a cop stopped the speeding Stirling, well, didn't know it was Stirling Moss at the time, at a traffic light and announced, so you think that you're blooming Stirling Moss. So that was a rather nice way of meeting a very special gentleman whom I came to work with again later on, as you'll hear. Well, by total luck, the board of Prime Computer from America happened to be at my conference, which meant which really went infinitely better than I could ever have imagined, and again by a great deal of luck. So I got voted with my family onto the President's Council, who whipped us off down to Disney World and gave me my first real, if you like, Phillip in the IT business. So thus begun another very unexpected and massively luck-filled 6-year career, which began a period for me and my family, frankly, beyond our wildest dreams. My first global product launch for Prime, strangely enough, was taking place in a French chateau. And it was for the very first, if you like, super mini that Prime produced, the 2250 it was called. Amazing, isn't it, as a marketing man, that we still have these extraordinary boring names for computer products. And the launch was with 500 international customers in the morning, and then we flew in a further 200 IT and international press in the afternoon. And the whole idea was that we would run simultaneous, if you like, shows in both France and in Boston at the same time. And there's the team that were in Boston there. It was kind of interesting. It was all about the very early days of packet switching. And I must be honest with you, given that we were going to do a live presentation or a live demo from this French chateau into our offices in Boston, I was extremely dubious that we'd ever pull it off. And in fact, I was so dubious, I'm afraid I insisted on renting, in those days, 50 of those 35mm projectors, so at least I could show what it should have done when it didn't. Well, to my sheer and utter delight, and perhaps personal surprise of a lot of us, it worked beautifully. That is until I was doing the Q&A at the end of the presentation to the international customers, when a gentleman jumped up and he said, I don't believe a word of it. I don't believe that this worked. And by the way, I work for Bank of America, and here's a slip of paper with the private entry into our mainframe in New York, and I expect you to be able to do this in just the same way that you've shown us this rather dubious demonstration. Well, I gave the piece of paper to the chief engineer, who came out up to my podium, and he was a bit ashen white, and I think I was probably trembling at that time. Believe it or not, we got straight in within seconds, and the whole place went mad. And of course, as you can imagine, that made a huge global market for those early Prime super minis. What fun those days were. Anyway, moving on. I had an American boss in those days, based in London, and we bumped into each other in our Paris office on a Wednesday afternoon. And he turned around to me and he said, oh, by the way, Michael, I want you to start working in Boston in the USA next Monday. Well, how incredibly mad was that? But of course, I think I'd learned by then, never give up without trying a challenge in life. And it was quite a challenge, believe me. It was particularly for my wife and our 3 children, one of whom included a young Down syndrome son. But there we go. And I ended up being, I think, the first person at that company ever to move from Europe to be based in the States. And my first show, by the way, a computing show in America, was in Los Angeles. And there's a nice little anecdote to this one. I was pretty good at putting up exhibition stands at that stage. And there was clearly the guy on the sort of corridor opposite me was really struggling. So I went over and gave him a hand. And at the end of the show, he came over to me and said, "Oh, thanks so much, for helping me out there. By the way, I'm really doing the proper launch of my company tonight, and it's going to be in a canyon just down the road, and we're going to have a Tex-Mex party. Oh, and incidentally, obviously you're invited. And afterwards, I've hired Disneyland from 10 o'clock tonight until 4 o'clock the next morning." It was only actually when somebody else came up to me, I realized that I had actually attended the global launch of Apple. And the gentleman I'd helped, by total luck, happened to be Steve Jobs, whom I bumped into a few more times after that. Anyway, it was a great experience working in America. I did lots of kickoffs, lots of product launches and sales meetings in Dallas, Atlanta, Los Angeles, and so on. But probably, I think the most fun thing I did in those days was I got the chance to make what I am told was the very first computer TV adverts, and it was for a Prime Computer in Australia. We did it in a secret studio back in London. I never like to ask quite why, but I had the great fun of working with Doctor Who, yes, one of the early ones, Tom Baker, and his delightful assistant, Lala, whom some of you may remember, who actually he went on to marry. And to this day, all of those ads you can look up under Prime Computer on YouTube. I think you'll find them quite fun, definitely different from the stuff you see today. Well, all good things, of course, come to an end. IBM moved in to take over, if you like, the less mature prime management roles in Boston, and basically they wanted to replace all of us with their IBM mates. So I returned back to the UK, a bit upset, but I did return as the European Marketing Director for Prime for a while. I joined, by, again, total chance, a Boston-based PR advertising and an advertising agency, and I started working with an amazing company called Wang. I wonder if any of the listeners remember Wang. They were, if you like, the global leaders in the word processing field. And it was about this time that I came up against a remarkable volunteer opportunity that more than definitely made up for my disappointment of coming back to work in the UK. My colleague in America, who was, if you like, running the Wang account for PR and advertising over there, had a niece who was very sadly very ill with leukemia. But apparently this little girl, all she wanted to do in life was to come to the United Kingdom and ride horses. And this was just an extraordinary break and a wonderful, what turned out to be a wonderful volunteer opportunity for me. My assistant and I sat down and we phoned up everybody we knew who had a horse. And of course, when they knew what it was about, everybody said yes. And even the King's Troop took this little girl on one of the gun carriages around Hyde Park. And I got really cheeky in the end and phoned the palace, and even the wonderful Princess Anne took her out riding with her. And I subsequently became one of the 4 founders of an extraordinary charity called the Starlight Children's Foundation. unbeknown to me, well, I knew that the little girl had gone back to America and sadly died a few weeks later. But her mum had written a book about the experience, which nobody ever here knew about. And I had a call from an actress in Los Angeles called Emma Samms. I wonder if any of you remember that terrible TV program called Dynasty. Well, Emma was kind of one of the leading actresses in that. And Emma asked me if I would be one of the 4 founders of this charity, which was primarily working with terminally and critically ill children in those early days, granting them wishes. Much to my surprise, in my early times of acting as a volunteer there, a lot of the families and the kids all wanted to go to Paris. Of course, by then, I knew all of the people in the Paris IT companies, and we were able to put forward programs for these families that money could never, ever have bought. And to give the family the most wonderful experience that they would remember if sadly their child passed on. So this was an extraordinary experience, and I'm really pleased that I managed to complete 15 years working with the Starlight Children's Foundation. It was such a privilege to touch the hearts of so many incredibly needy families. And of course, it proved just how generous the computer industry really could be if you put them on the spot. A wonderful, wonderful organization, and I'm so privileged to have worked with them. Well, anyway, back to the advertising and PR agency with the strange name of Hill Holiday, Connors and Cosmopolis. They did, in fact, take both Lotus Development and Wang from garage businesses to global multi-million-dollar companies. And it was largely driven by extensive ad budgets and extraordinary PR events, at which I had wonderful time working with Wang and their then European marketing director, which was a guy called Ken Eaves, who turned out to play a rather important part in my future life and career. Well, I had something like £22 million of advertising budget, and so it got me back into doing these amazing TV adverts, some of which were done in, strangely enough, English cathedrals for the American market. And it was great fun. I did major press events across Europe with them. And this one, I have to mention, this is one of these embarrassing walking into the confession box for me. I had this great idea when Wang came out with the fastest ever, of course, fastest ever word processor. And I thought, I know what we'll do. I'll go back to my old mate Stirling Moss, who of course was the fastest driver in the world in those days. And I'll hire a train, and we'll put all of the journalists and the customers on the train, and we'll put these latest Wang processors in front of them on the train, so they can play with them on the way up to Manchester. And I think I paid under the a dirty envelope to the train driver to try and make it also the fastest train run between London and Manchester in those days. Well, inevitably, of course, the power surge on the train as it left St Pancras or wherever it was blew all of my computers in about the first 10 minutes of the journey. So everybody, of course, enjoyed the bar. And we eventually got to Alton Towers, where I had been working very hard on building a magnificent sort of scaffolding platform on which I'd found this fantastic photographer who was due to get my best photograph of Stirling Moss sitting in the front of this Wang train ride with a Wang computer in front of him, putting on a bowler hat and carrying an umbrella. Well, Stirling, very wisely, I hasten to add, took one look at this and said, "Oh no, over my dead body, you're going to get me on that thing." My boss, my client, Ken Eaves, took one look at me and said, "Michael, your idea, get in it." And sadly for me, the photographer wasn't quite as good as I thought they were. And I did the first couple of rounds, had to stop this ride, and I needed to go behind a tree and throw up. It took 6 more goes before we could get this photograph that you're seeing here. And of course, on each of those, I had to stop the train, and I was pretty ill. It was not a good experience. Sterling Moss thought it was extremely funny. And by the way, I couldn't actually drive a car back to London for 2 days because I was so disorientated. There were some other kind of memorable moments with Wang. I ended up opening a new factory in Scotland with His Royal Highness Prince Charles, who, on handing him one of our wonderful, highest, speediest word processors in the world, immediately handed it back to me with something along the lines of, Michael, I've got no idea what to do with this. I'm sure you can find a home for it. And of course, it went straight back to the Starlight headquarters in London. I was able to do lots of global product launches with Wang, and some very interesting encounters with Dr. Wang and his family, who of course founded the company. And there were lots of things, lovely stories, but I'll just pick on one if I may. Unfortunately, like a lot of these companies, they got things a little bit wrong at one stage, and the stock literally fell overnight by almost millions and millions of dollars. And of course, it was the following morning that I was accompanying Dr. Wang, who was being interviewed by Matthew, can't remember his surname, but he was the technical correspondent for the Financial Times. And I was dreading the moment when Matthew would turn around to Dr. Wang and he would say, "Well, doctor, how does it feel to be millions of dollars worse off this morning than you were last night?" And of course, the question came up, and I leant across to Dr. Wang, ready to try and give him my best attempt on earth to handle the journalist on this. And the doctor turned around to me very coolly and very calmly. He said, "Don't worry, Michael, I can handle this." And he turned around to Matthew and he said, "Matthew, you have to remember, when I arrived in the United States all those years ago from Shanghai with my family, I had precisely $100 in my pocket. So do you think I'm worried too much about using a few million last night? No." Well, of course, Wang, unfortunately, was one of those amazing companies that fell into demise. And of course, it's very easy afterwards to say, well, it was too specialist, you know, and there were other people coming along with PCs that could do a lot more than word processing. Probably the biggest mistake, to be honest, was that the doctor put his son Fred in as his successor. I guess typical nepotism. And fortunately, by the time that happened, I had moved on. As I constantly remind people, it's all about when you, not just when you arrive, but when you leave. So in the mid-80s, I joined ICL. In fact, at the request of their new president of International, who happened to be an ex-prime computer country manager for Sweden. And at that time, ICL, and I'm sure many of you will know ICL or will have worked for them, were making that move from the dependency on the mainframes to departmental systems. Well, I thought, gosh, I'm onto a winner here. The first week I spent in Florida on the Phil Crosby quality course, whose process I was immediately tasked to set up across the world. It was actually quite a big dip in salary, but it proved to be, probably in my experience, the best possible investor in its employees than anyone else I ever met in my career. And I guess the lesson I learned was, try, if you can, to always work for people and in companies that are prepared to grow and develop you. I got very used to being sucked dry for my experience by everybody else, and this was a truly quite remarkable company in my view. I did more dramatic international product launches for, again, funny enough, out of a French chateau. I wonder why. And that was for their product called the All-in-One, which was a glorified failure. And I did a few more major international press events. Actually, my favorite job, really, I guess, with ICL was running the ICL global user group. And I had the magnificent job of coming back into Putney and delivering the challenging messages to the senior management from sometimes our disgruntled customers from around the world. They were absolutely fabulous. And in fact, it was a very smart company because they did listen to what the customers said. And usually we managed to pull our fingers out and do a better job for them afterwards. I loved working at ICL with this wonderful, wonderful team of country managers. They were a really seriously professional team. And I during the time working with them, I got to run apparently the IT's first ever industry events in Hungary when it was still under under Russian control, and also in Turkey. But I had one of the biggest lessons of my entire career. And it was kind of an interesting one that cost me dearly and cost somebody else possibly even more dearly. I had gone on to the assumption, of course, that when you worked with somebody that you know all about them. Well, let's call him Tomo, shall we? The president of International came up to me one day and he said, Michael, I'd really like you to come up with some amazing thing to pull my country managers together and build our team spirit and get them all to enjoy life and respect each other. Now, I knew that my so-called Tomo happened to jog every morning with his wife out in his home in Ascot. And I happened to know that he'd been an intrepid yachtsman in those small and dangerous islands off Sweden for many, many years. And he was a fit man. So I thought, I know what we'll do. I'll help him look a hero in front of his country managers. And I went off and I found an extraordinary character called John Ridgeway. It might ring a bell to you. He was an ex-SAS soldier. He'd rowed the Atlantic and he'd sailed single-handed around the world in his wonderful yacht. Ooh, boy, oh boy. Will I ever forget the first day when the country manager team, probably after traveling for the best part of 48 hours from Japan and Australia, rolled up in their lovely Gucci shoes and their Rolex watches, off a decrepit bus at Cape Wrath in a very, very remote area of Scotland. And John Ridgeway beckoned us all to a bunch of kayaks sitting in the heather and explaining that we needed to just paddle 1.5 miles up the loch to the timber-framed headquarters where we were going to spend the next 3 nights. Well, everything went pretty well till we were within about 20 meters of the shore, and we could smell the wonderful supper coming out of the log cabin. And John Ridgeway turned to, shall we call him Tomo, my boss, and said, okay, gentlemen, what I want you all to do now is to invert your kayaks and then tap on the inverted kayak 3 times on the top, which of course I'll be able to see, just to know that you're in control of your lives and you're good, brave, hearty people. And of course, the first person he pointed to was, oh dear, my boss, who of course refused to do it point blank. At which stage, Australia called out, oh, I'll do it. And he whipped his kayak over, 3 fantastic taps on the underside, whipped it back up again and zapped into the thing and was the first at the bar and the first in front of the nice log fire. At which stage, of course, every one of the country managers felt, well, I'm not going to let the Aussie have one over me. And they all did it, even including one guy who couldn't even swim. So you can tell I had made a rather serious mistake by judging somebody who was my boss and choosing something which was to be probably his downfall and also my own downfall. In fact, unfortunately, the last time I heard of the chap I'm going to call Tomo was that he moved to America and he became the president of a company called Symbol Technologies. But the last anybody heard of my so-called Tomo was as his lawyer stood up in a court in New York and announced that the alleged disappearance of several millions of dollars from this company was not to be found. Neither was his client, who had just sent him a little note saying, I'm not going to join you in court, sorry about that. Actually, I'm no longer in the United States of America, and I'm never, ever coming back. And to this day, I'm told the FBI are still looking for him. Well, it was an interesting learning curve, and one which I'd never do again. And of course, it led to me being made redundant in the first tranche of reorganizations at ICL. But I learned another lesson. As one door closes, another door opens, and very often it's even better than the first one. And my work, of course, with Starlight had become more challenging as I continued to travel a lot more. And something rather timely and wonderful was about to change my volunteering life to this very day. You'll remember that I mentioned my old client from Wang, Ken Eaves. He persuaded me to apply for membership of a city livery company, believe it or not, called the Worshipful Company of Information Technologists. It's sort of it's the 100th livery company, 100, and that was no piece of luck, out of the 110 that exist today. And it sort of follows the tradition of 1,000 years worth of city livery companies. It supports, of course, us, the IT industry and our profession. It supports training and education, and of course, very importantly, supports charitable work through the adaptation and adoption of IT. Today, it's got some 800 senior, very successful IT folk in it. The members range from entrepreneurs, founders of Logica and Oracle, to IT lawyers, CIOs, CTOs, IT consultants, etc. The nice thing about it for me was that each and every one of them was on payback into society for being grateful for their successful IT careers. There are actually today 19 panel working groups, all of which are orientated at paying back through charity into society. There's a homeless panel, a disabilities panel, one that works with children's hospices. In fact, even two of the panels over the years have founded 2 national charities. And I joined the education, the communications, and the employment groups. And it was and has and will always be a quite extraordinary experience. I mentioned Ken Eaves, who got me in there. Incidentally, Ken was a vice president of the BCS, and today he is Sir Ken Eaves, quoted as the most powerful black man in the United Kingdom. And I love this picture because although somebody who probably isn't laughing too much today, i.e. His Royal Highness Prince Andrew, I love that somebody sitting there was most definitely not amused. Ken today escorts Her Majesty and other members of the royal family as the Lord Lieutenant of Greater London. So watch out for him on TV. Whenever you see a member of the royal family, Ken will be there. Well, moving on, I joined a newly formed international marketing team at, can you believe, yes, Commodore. Has anybody not got a Commodore product somewhere up in their loft? I must admit, it was a bit of a mixed experience. I worked and joined an absolutely brilliant team of marketeers, and of course, Commodore had the most phenomenal grasp of the consumer electronics market and was a true trailblazer. My role, together with the team, was to introduce their first PC and to push what were in those days known as the Amiga products. They were the early graphics technologies, which were way ahead of their times, and which are, I believe, applauded by many people even in today's situation. This, of course, was my first insight into the games industry, which I still believe to this day is an enormous opportunity to add both members, ethics and professionalism to the hugely important developing market of the games industry. And I dream one day that we in the BCS may have all of the people that founded and who run that particular part of technology. Its demise, however, at Commodore was its top management and its company culture. Oh dear, and here we go with another story of a learning curve for me, which was not particularly a happy one. This team was sent, worked very hard on producing an international marketing strategy, a global strategy for Commodore. And because the founder, Irving Gould of the company, was actually a tax exile from America, we had to go and meet him up in Toronto. Irving, by the way, was currently, I think, owns most of the Gambia. And we arrived there, and there was a chap called Mehdi Ali, who was the CEO at the time, and Peter Bailey, the leader of our team, a totally brilliant guy, most delightful character, stood up and he said to them both, "Well, gentlemen, I would like now to introduce you to the international marketing strategy that we've developed for you." At which stage the CEO jumped out of his seat and at the top of his voice screamed, "I never want to hear that word strategy again." Well, of course, you can guess what happened. The entire team left immediately to go and fill out their CVs and to find another job, and so did I. Except they were probably the smart ones. They all left and went on to greater things, except me. I had a rather strange phone call about 2 days afterwards, and it was right at the beginning of the first Gulf War. And the CEO called me up. He said, Michael, we've chosen you to do the introduction of the world's first interactive TV, which, by the way, was really coming in 10 years too early. It was, in those days, it was an engineering dream, but it was a marketing nightmare, way ahead of its time. And he explained to me that he wanted me to do my European job on Monday and Tuesday. And on Wednesday, he wanted me to roll up at the Fifth Avenue office, where he would meet with me and hear my reports on how progress was going. Oh, the office, by the way, I shouldn't really mention this, but I will, was the wallpaper was elephant skin. I mean, oh my gosh. Anyway, and then he said, oh, on Thursdays and Fridays, by the way, I want you just to continue on either 1 week to Westchester in Pennsylvania to the factory and work the team there. And then the next week, I want you to pop on down to Los Angeles and do Thursday and Friday down there. And of course, obviously, you're going to be weekly commuting by Concorde, which sounded great at the time, until I ended up doing it for an entire year. And it was only 2 weeks into the job that I realized why he'd chosen me, which made me feel even worse about it. Being, of course, a reserve army officer, and being a Brit who, of course, had worked for years running through airports with the Baader-Meinhof gangs and so on, wasn't too fussed or freaked out by traveling on planes during a Gulf War. My colleagues, however, apparently in the Westchester headquarters office, would not get onto an aeroplane and would not travel on an aeroplane across to Los Angeles at all. So I felt I was rather taken advantage of there. But let's face it, there was some fun as well. And actually the upside of it was that I ended up working with the inventor of the very first computer game, Nolan Bushnell. Do you remember Ping Pong? That was the first computer game. I'm sure we've all done it. I even actually managed to beat Nolan at it once, only once, I hasten to add. And Nolan founded Atari, which was the very first games console, a absolutely lovely, delightful billionaire. And I have to say, actually, when we eventually did this launch together, although it was a dreadful product and completely the wrong time, we did attract 600 people to the International Press Conference, which I'm told is the biggest press gathering ever in those days for a computer. Anyway, of course, yes, you guessed it, The minute I'd done the launch, I was made redundant. But no fear, right place, right time, yet again. And here comes another learning curve. My ex-head of Commodore, this wonderful man, Peter Bailey, offered me a great job with a fantastic company, Lotus Development. So there's the lesson. Never ever make enemies, because you never know who your next boss might be. This company, Lotus Development, had the most wonderful culture. It couldn't have been more different from Commodore. It was a very professional company with fantastic products. I was lucky enough to lead a team of 30 marketeurs. And do you know, just to show you what sort of company it was, I do remember my interview there, which was not by Peter Bailey, my ex-boss, or my new boss-to-be. And the question was, and tell me, Michael, what have you ever done for other people? And I suddenly realized that I was in a highly charitable, really socially aware company. They even matched, you know, if the employees were encouraged to go off and work for several days a year doing charity work or volunteer work, and if they were fundraising for charities, the company would come in and would match the funds. My first job with them was to launch Lotus Notes globally. It was a wonderful experience and a wonderful, wonderful product. I did kickoffs for global meetings with 1,000 employees in places like Vienna and Cyprus. And I began to spend a couple of days a week visiting 3 countries on an airplane going somewhere else every week. But of course, oh golly, you've heard me say this before, of course, in IT supplier industry, all things eventually come to an end. And as you probably know, Lotus was actually sold off to IBM, to the demise of all my wonderful products. And the vice president for Europe and his 5 directors, of which I was one, were all laid off. Again, here we go. Incidentally, my boss, who was a marvelous, marvelous man, Paul Bailey, went off to work for Lord Alan Sugar, yes, of the Apprentice TV fame. I won't say any more, but Paul fled, I think that's the right word to use, fled after working with Lord Sugar for 3 days, and of course went on to have a spectacular career elsewhere. Well, I actually took a short-term interim role after my 3rd redundancy, and I joined FAST, the Federation Against Software Theft. I was sponsored by Microsoft, and it was a very interesting sort of policing role, protecting some of the software industry's most valuable products. I have to admit, I was deeply shocked at the lack of ethics in some of the user companies and even the government departments who cheated on buying software license fees. One of the first things I did was actually I put in a sneak line. It was a telephone line where you could welsh on your employer if you knew they weren't paying their licenses. I was deeply surprised when my first call was from a squadron leader in the RAF telling me that they didn't pay any license fees for anything that they had. But there we go. Well, I guess at this stage I was beginning to experience for the first time in my career the rampant ageism that very sadly, I believe even today in some areas of our profession and the IT business is still haunting us. I was 48 and I was incredibly lucky to join yet another remarkable and extraordinary company. It was called Gateway Computers. Mind you, I had to move to Dublin to find a decent European marketing director's role, but I loved it. I didn't know until I got there and I started looking around. I said to the HR guy, gosh, everybody looks so young. And he said to me, oh, yes, Michael, didn't we mention that the average age of our employees is 25? And it was probably only about 10 days later that I heard somebody, as I was walking by, saying, oh, gosh, there goes Zimmerman, hopefully affectionately. And I found myself working with 1,000 young, incredibly bright people at this Irish International call centre. Luckily, I actually love working with a younger team. And for me, it was an extraordinary situation because this, of course, was somebody who sold direct to early adopters for both PCs and laptops. And believe it or not, it really was the first time in my entire industry experience that I actually knew which customers had bought from me, what they'd bought, where and when they'd bought it. So, of course, I knew how to cross-sell or upsell or whatever. It was a data bonanza. Unfortunately, the chap who founded the company, who came from good farming stock in an area, didn't understand he was sitting on a gold mine. And of course, we all know who did understand what sitting on a gold mine of data was, and that was Michael Dell. Well, if nothing else, it did allow me to discover mid-America, which I'd really never been to before. And the headquarters was in Sioux City. And I remember to this day, I had to catch a little sort of 8-seater airplane from Chicago down to Sioux City. And I remember as the gangway went down, there was the most incredible smell. And I turned to one of my fellow passengers and I said, "Good grief, what on earth is that?" To which he responded to me, "Oh, if you come to Sioux City, you're either working for Gateway or you're skinning hogs." It was an interesting introduction to real Americans, actually, and totally and utterly different from the people I knew on the East Coast and the West Coast. And I loved them dearly. And I could see how our industry was largely born out of mid-America and the ethics that came with the early venturers in there. It was an interesting experience. It was incredibly tough breaking into the German market, who were completely adverse to buying direct or ordering direct at all. And of course, for those of you that remembered Gateway, it was tough selling to corporates when every single box of a computer was actually adorned with a Frisian cow branding, hence the cow in the picture here. I deeply enjoyed that I could still be learning whole new approaches to the computer industry after having been in it for 25 years. And I got to open, rather ironically, the same factory for them in Dublin. The second time, I'd opened it for Prime, and then I opened it for Gateway. And I completed my milestone 320th trip to the United States whilst I was working with them. Eventually, I guess really, if I'm honest, my family circumstances meant that I needed to return to the UK for my son. And guess what? At 50, it proved absolutely impossible for me to get another suitable role as a marketing director, an international marketing director in an IT corporation. And I actually, very luckily, had started whilst I worked for Gateway to chair IT conferences in the USA, the UK, and Eastern Europe. And my network of IT channel marketing people was, I'm told, the best in the world. And obviously, I also got to be pretty good at some other specialist roles. So by luck and by usual, my usual way, because I'd always enjoyed meeting new people and advancing the careers of those of my teams, circumstances forced me, yes, forced me to take the brave step towards starting my own company. And I set up a very small international IT headhunting recruitment company using no capital and working from home. Oh my gosh, it thrived beyond my wildest dreams and I loved it. I worked for clients in IBM, IDG, Dell, and numerous other US-based companies, helping them set up in Europe, and of course recruiting all of their senior management teams. I should have done it 10 years earlier, and hopefully this experience will help other IT professionals to make that independent step much earlier than I did. and I would encourage everyone to be far more brave than I was, much earlier in their careers than I was. Well, I had 5 years of running my own company, and then it came to an abrupt halt. No, I wasn't made redundant because nobody could make me redundant. But I entered what I would describe as my pro bono career. I was either working for a very minimum amount or indeed no remuneration at all. But it proved just as exciting and just as rewarding as my corporate IT career. But of course, it does put a lot of financial pressure on you. And there was a CEO, or actually they were called a clerk, who was running that livery, the IT livery company that I mentioned earlier, and that individual resigned, and I was flooded with calls to apply for the post. No, it was not a wise financial decision, but I'll leave you to understand that I did it actually with absolutely no regrets. I found myself working with some of the nicest folk that I've ever met in my entire career. And as volunteer members, of course, it was like trying to persuade, as their CEO, 800 chiefs to work very much like charity Indians. I managed to raise, with the help of others, £1 million out of our membership. And we actually built our first school, the Hammersmith Academy, which was an IT and new media school in a particularly needy and depressed area of West London, up near Goldhawk Road. And I also got to help convert the Lillian Baylis School, which was a Lambeth school in the toughest area of London. And we managed to get them new buildings and to form them into an IT school with wonderful turnaround Ofsted results. And I guess probably those two things founded my passion for education, which was to greatly influence my future volunteering. Well, as you can imagine, I suppose the livery company was a bit of a rarefied lifestyle, and my role as clerk enabled me to meet and to get to know some of my IT heroes. One of the things I had to do from time to time was to perform a sort of city livery ceremonial where we were awarding freedom ceremonies to members to join the Worshipful Company of Information Technologists. I think the first one I did was with this fantastic guy. Hopefully you all recognize him. This is Vint Cerf, of course, one of the main founders of the internet. I think probably his business card today reads as it did on that occasion, which was for Google, with whom he still works, and his card simply said, Internet Guru. Vint was the most remarkable chap and still is. I still luckily bump into him from time to time today. A brilliant communicator, simply wonderful for the children at my schools. I could just point a camera at him and say, Vint, give some wonderful uplifting message about computing to our school students, and off he'd go and wheel away. I also got the great privilege, of course, of doing the same ceremony for Sir Tim Berners-Lee, naturally the founder of the World Wide Web. I hope you'll forgive me, but I've got to tell you a little story about Sir Tim. During this ceremony, I had to sort of unroll a parchment from which both Vint and Tim had to read various words. Well, I sent the words off to both of them weeks in advance so that they wouldn't trip over them on the occasion in front of everybody. And I didn't hear back from Tim until he hit Heathrow, and he was in a cab on his way up to the livery hall where I was going to perform this ceremony, and he was clearly reading what the declaration was, and I thought perfectly reasonably, he said, "Excuse me, Michael, it says here I have to obey the master. I've never met the master. I have no idea who the future masters are going to be." And I thought, well, you know what? He's got a point, actually. And I certainly wasn't going to lose the chance of having Sir Tim Berners-Lee as an honorary freeman of my livery company. So I quickly found that lovely yellow sticky stuff, attached it over the relevant words in the parchment, and as I unrolled it, there was a nice gap which missed out the words that he didn't want to say. And to my utter amazement, clearly nobody in the audience, actually noticed that he'd missed them out in the first place. So great guy, really, really lovely. I met many other sort of heroes. Uh, I met many city lord mayors during that time, and still do today, actually. In fact, one of them was Peter Estlin, not more than just a few weeks ago, who, of course, opened our brand new BCS offices in the city. I also got to meet with Buzz Armstrong, second man on the moon, and this wonderful lady, whom I hope many of you will know. This is my mentor when I was CEO, and also a past president of the BCS. Can you still hear me? I heard something in the background there. Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, all right, yeah, I'll carry on. Okay. This was my mentor and a past master of that IT livery company, and of course, more importantly, a past president of the BCS. And it's Steve Shirley, as she's affectionately known to all of us in the IT industry. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? All right, I'm going to tell you anyway. Steve Shirley was one of the railway children escaping from the Nazis who landed at the station in London, and was effectively adopted by a lovely English couple. Right from a very early stage, he was determined to be one of the first women ever to enter and to be in the IT industry. And she worked very hard at it. And when she got to the right stage of applying for jobs, she wrote out her CV and strangely enough, didn't receive any offers for an interview. And then, of course, being the bright, incredibly bright lady she is, she sussed it. They all know me as Stephanie Shirley. I'm going to change my name by default to Steve, which she duly did. And strangely enough, yes, she got the interviews and got fantastic jobs, and of course went on to form one of the world's most amazing international IT consultancies, the FI Group, which still exists today. And certainly at my last count, this remarkable lady had donated over £53 million of her personal wealth into charitable purpose, very largely for autistic children. And she also did a remarkable thing for the IT livery company, which was buying the freehold of our hall. And I hope that for those of you that maybe haven't come across her, that you will all read her wonderful, wonderful, captivating book, which has some interesting stories like mine from the IT industry. I did actually receive a call when I was a clerk from, I assumed it was from Buckingham Palace, and somebody said to me, "Oh, please, can you tell me a little bit about Steve Shirley?" To which, of course, my response was, "Oh, you must mean Steve." And apparently, they were considering at the time, clearly, of making her a well-deserved dame. So today she's back as Dame Stephanie Shirley, although I don't think she feels too badly when we all still call her Steve. Do read her book. Now, of course, one of the other great benefits of that job in the livery company was to understand the unique makeup of the city and of those who run it, with their 15 years voluntary work behind them. And the fact that they've had to become aldermen, sheriffs, and then eventually some of them move on to Lord Mayor. And after 5 years as the clerk, I was all set to retire at the end of my period. And I've been working in the last few months at sorting out a celebration for a royal charter. Yes, a royal charter, just like the BCS one, which, believe you me, is no small mean effort and a great deal of hard work. And I was really responsible to some larger degree to organising a special service in St Paul's, and then a wonderful celebration dinner with His Royal Highness Prince Edward in Mansion House afterwards. But just in case you're wondering why I'm carrying a pizza box here, I must explain. The morning before, I'd gone down to the Privy Council offices, that's the one headed up by Her Majesty, where I was informed that there was an acute shortage of parchment. And it was just possible that the next day, when I had my ceremony, which I knew I couldn't turn off, that I may not have a royal charter at all. So I'm afraid we came up with this ridiculous idea of a pizza box, which I could then process through the streets of London and into the Mansion House and pop it in front of His Royal Highness, explaining that he mustn't open it, please, because it might get soup on it. And to my immense relief, I actually managed to go along that very morning, and they had found some parchment, and I did actually have a royal charter. But little did I know what led ahead, because I was off immediately after this wonderful occasion, spending time with my family based in Pittsburgh, where we try and go every year for a few weeks, giving respite to my daughter and to our Downs autistic grandson. In fact, last summer it was wonderful. We spent the time trying to teach a service dog, which has become a pet and is completely useless as a service dog. But sadly, I guess we won't be seeing them this summer. Anyway, I had a surprise message from the IT livery company asking me to return for a 3-year role as warden and then eventually master. Well, this was the most wonderful training for my role as the BCS president. I was chairing court meetings and charity boards and acting as an ambassador for the IT industry, and of course leading a team of incredibly clever and influential industry leaders. And I thought when I left that I knew everything about setting up and helping schools. So that led to my next volunteering role, which was in education. Little did I realize I knew nothing about education whatsoever, and was to spend the next year almost every night on some course learning the language, which of course in education is even more complicated than our IT industry language, or indeed that of the military. But I decided to join as a governor a miserable failing secondary school in a very depressed area, rural area of Hampshire, which, by the way, had 5 teachers in 1 year. I hadn't at that stage learnt the skills of my colleagues in stepping back as fast as they did, and I ended up very quickly as if you like, the governor or the chair of governors of the school. It was part of the Chichester University Academies Trust, and that happens to be a university which does largely teacher training and is a sports university. So it was just wonderful to be able to, if you like, parachute in these train the trainers, these teach the teachers, and to turn around that school, which went from being absolutely appalling to today being a good, with excellent and improved Ofsted behaviour. And here it is. We literally opened this just a few weeks ago with a £30 million grant that we'd worked very hard to get, and the kids are doing absolutely wonderfully. And of course, I've used my IT network to encourage computer science students and teachers, and it's been a hugely satisfying and worthwhile activity. I became the trustee over the last 4 years of the Academies Trust, and we now have 15 schools today, and they're all aimed to turn around failing schools in very needy and depressed areas. So it has been challenging, but it has been changing the lives and indeed the prospects of some 5,000 young people, and of course the opportunity to help inspire some 250 teachers. Now, the BCS has a hugely successful record in education, as I hope you're all aware. And I hope you'll forgive me if I just take a couple of minutes. I want to tell you about 2 of the BCS areas of influence in education. First of all, there's computing at school. You probably all know of it as CAS. It supports computing teachers in both secondary and primary schools, and it gives them the most wonderful training materials, and it helps them to share very best practice. And of course, the BCS has undoubtedly helped through the NCC to grow the number of computing teachers, but sadly not enough yet. And we've changed the computing curriculum. Computer science is now included as that fourth science in EBAC for the school performance measure. And that this whole CAS area has been so well established and is so highly regarded. And the second education area that I just wanted quickly to mention is barefoot computing, which is funded, of course, by BT, the British Telecom, and it's all about helping primary school kids aged between 8 and 10 learn those building blocks of our digital world. And it helps to provide guidance to the primary teachers to apply computational thinking in their lessons. It's got fantastic free lesson plans and tutor notes. It holds teacher workshops to meet and support one to another, and it's very, very successful and well thought of program. My only regret is that in the current massive TV advertising campaign of BT around this area, that they sadly didn't recognise the huge support of the BCS in this program. Now, just in case you think that my volunteering days are over and I'm a bit too long in the tooth, wrong. Last month, I joined a fantastic, relatively new organisation called the Positive Transformation Initiative. And this is, if you like, the ultimate network of networks. And those of you that have got a good screen, you might even notice that somebody has come back into my life again. The chairman of this is no other than Sir Kenneth Alyssa. And it's all about increasing opportunities for deserving young people and veterans and ex-offenders, and really to, if you like, kickstart their lives and their careers. And it's about supporting existing charities and projects through funding, expertise and resources, and not trying to reinvent the wheel anywhere. I'm in the process of currently setting up a national board with hopefully what will be 10 local branches, with a team which is called Tech and Law for Good. And I'm hoping very much that we'll be collaborating with both the BCS and, of course, also the IT livery company as we grow this operation. And dare I say it, I'm looking, of course, for volunteers to join me on the board and in the local branches. So end of the commercial, but if you feel so inclined, please come back to me afterwards, won't you? Well, back to my career just for the last couple of minutes, you'll be massively relieved to hear. My early military voluntary career luckily grew into working closely with the Royal Corps of Signals, both with the IT livery company, and actually I spent a number of years working on one of the regimental committees for the Royal Signals. Even today, of course, in the BCS, we're actually working very closely with the Corps, who don't focus any longer on radio and telephone comms, but of course as IT professionals. And as some of you may know, we've succeeded in aligning their qualifications to Sophia Plus, therefore, of course, enhancing their careers and the opportunities that they'll have on leaving the service. And just for a little bit of fun, I thought I would conclude, just in case you thought that I enjoy dressing up a little bit too much, let me just confirm it. And I thought, as it's St. George's Day, this would be a good way to wind up. For the past 15 years, I've served as what's called a pikeman, a volunteer pikeman, in the Lord Mayor's bodyguard of the City of London. And we are one of Her Majesty's three Majesty's Guards at state events. So I go to the state events, and I do a lot of events for charities. I even have to march, can you believe, 5.5 miles every year in the Lord Mayor's show, which of course it's always raining. You can see me here getting incredibly wet and miserable. But I can apparently carry on doing this until the day when I fall over on the cobbles and I'm unable to pick myself up with my armour and my pike and my sword, and a member of the public has to help me, in which case I am off and out. But I have to tell you that over those 15 years, I've met more presidents, kings and queens of countries that frankly I didn't even know existed, and actually just a couple that I wish I hadn't. Well, you'll be relieved to hear I'm pretty much at the end of my rather varied and rather unusual career. I've been hugely honoured to have been elected as your past BCS president by the BCS council members, and I will, without a shadow of a doubt, continue to serve and support our industry until I drop, which might not be all that further forward. But as you've heard, I've been, to be honest about it, in the right place far, far more times than I deserve. If indeed I'd been a rich man, which I'm not, I would happily have paid for every single day in our wonderful, wonderful IT industry and profession. And my volunteer roles have helped me, as a true child of charity, I hope, to pay back in some small way into society and to do my bit in making IT good for society. Well, I'm now going to revert for the last couple of minutes, believe it or not, to PowerPoint, and just very quickly going to run through some of the lessons I've learned to remind you. First of all, don't forget the IT profession is the very best in the UK for social mobility. My whole point about every child really deserves and needs a good education. And you will have seen from my early career, I made lots of risky moves to find my initial lucky break. That wonderful example of never make an enemy, because you never know who your next boss may be. And that the rather salutary one, don't ever assume that you know everything about your colleagues, and don't fall into the trap that I did. And of course, I rejoice at this one. As an ex-headhunter, people used to come to me full of despondence when they were laid off through redundancy. And I say, rejoice when you're made redundant, because your next job is probably going to be much better than the one you just lost. And again, to get the best out of life for both you and others, volunteer and volunteer, and network and network and network. And always, unlike me, check the corporate culture and the management style of a company before you join some new employer. And please, please fight against ageism in our profession. You will have seen that an international career can be great and a lot of fun, but of course, rarely indeed for your family, and indeed also for my family. And I entreat you, be braver sooner than I was. Start your own business, get into consultancy, do something amazing, and don't need the kick that I had to do that. And something I definitely learned is that you'll rarely ever make sufficient wealth to completely retire. Thank goodness for that, because I would go potty if I fully retired. And that lovely one of helping others in their careers and work to make the world a better place. And always, whatever the world does around you, whatever traumas you have or we may have in the future, just try and remember how incredibly lucky we are to have worked in our wonderful profession and industry. And now I'm really going to shut up.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was a fantastic presentation. And certainly I learned so much about your career that I just wasn't aware of. And I'm sure everybody else will actually agree with those. Could I just add one other thing? When you said about CAS, that anybody could actually sign up to join for free onto the CAS network. And I think they're very, if I'm correct, they're very keen on encouraging non-teachers as well to join in, because they can still contribute.
Yeah, very good point, Margaret. Thank you.
So just do a search on CAS and go in. But so far, there's no specific questions. Can we take the microphone off the attendees?
That sounds good. Thank you very much indeed for listening, and may you all stay well and safe.
Thank you very much. I think there's no other questions or comments. In which case, I think we'd like to thank you so much, and again, add on to what. Ah, right, great. Somebody coming through? No, okay.
I believe that was me, but this is Sean Sadler. So hi, Michael.
Hi, Sean.
We know each other. Real pleasure actually to know you. And I know a lot of your history because of I came to a BCS event before, and you told me something about that, and others obviously that were there. So I just want to say how inspirational you are, really. You know, you've led a fabulously wonderful life, haven't you, within IT, and obviously the volunteering that you've done. So it's really inspirational. The thing I missed there, I think, was the CAS that you just mentioned. Sorry. So what was that you said again about you can volunteer there? Well, that, and what would the website address be for that?
It's just, if you do a search, just even on Google or on the BCS for CAS, it's Computers at School.
Okay.
This is where they've got all this a massive material, and you can join in get involved with some of their chats. Sometimes there's questions that come up, maybe that if you're working in the industry, you might be in a position to answer. They're very, very keen to encourage non-teachers to also become members of CAS. And you've got membership of it actually worldwide. So, you know, there is, I can't remember actually the percentage, I don't know whether you remember, Michael, between the teachers and non-teachers, but I've got a feeling it was roughly about at least a third non-teachers.
Yes, I think it was.
Okay, well, I'll definitely look into joining there. And it's great news also that you've come on as part of the PTI, Michael. I think that's such a fabulous initiative by Dan Brown.
Oh, I'm very thrilled with this. I think we are going to turn the world upside down with this, which would be great. For the better, I hasten to add.
Yes. That's all from me. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from anyone?
Hi, Michael. It's Steve here. Steve Paul. Just great to hear your voice again.
Oh, and, Steve, I can't believe it.
And I remember those crazy last few weeks, months in Commodore. Wasn't that a strange time? And yeah, some characters. And I remember the elephant skin wallpaper. It wasn't a great sight, was it? And
no,
that crazy journey we made back via planes, trains, helicopters, and what have you.
Oh, Steve, it's so lovely to talk to you. I haven't spoken to you for such a long time.
I know. Would it be great to hook up sometime, Michael? But great to hear the stories and to remember the old days. Really great.
Well, of course, I never guessed there'd be somebody on there that could correct me, or maybe, you know, look at some of my exaggerations or some of my inaccuracies. Or
well, I do remember Nolan Bushnell from Commodore, the time that he spoke to an English audience and referred to what the Americans would, what we'd call the bottom, but they'd call something else, and he got rather some raised eyebrows at that time. I remember that.
But a lovely guy.
Yeah, great guy. Great to talk to you, Mike. Nice to hear from you.
Good to talk to you as well. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen in.
No problems. It was great fun. Thanks, Michael. Talk to you soon.
Okay.
Do you have any other comments from anybody else?
I think you've all been incredibly patient, and I suspect you're all dying to get out there and enjoy what's left of this beautiful, beautiful day.
Well, your timing was superb for coming in before 7 o'clock. It's great. Thank you very much. If everybody is actually, could you mute your mic so we can actually share appreciations? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Well done, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We might.
And thank you, Margaret, for giving me the opportunity to do this. I hope I didn't bore everybody senseless.
It was brilliant, absolutely perfect. And there's definitely, I can see some possibilities where actually I'd like to have a chat to you later on about coming back and doing some follow-up webinars.
Oh, well, as long as I don't get asked to do a sort of data analytics or something of which I can definitely write on the back of a postage stamp. Thank you so much for all your help, and thank you for the invitation. I've enjoyed doing it. I hope I haven't completely wrecked everybody's evening.
No, so so pleased that we were sort of linked in with the Coventry branch and the Dorset branch and also London Central. So I think
that was lovely. I mean, I think that I'm going back to Rebecca after this, and I'm going to encourage her to follow through on these virtual meetings, because she in her year as president can obviously touch and talk to far more people than you could ever do under other circumstances.
Yes, and it's wonderful, particularly specialist groups. Most of us have got between about 15 to 20% overseas members for the specialist groups. Well, certainly the ones I'm involved with, and you know, something like having the recorded version, it can be sent out. You can contact them and say, anybody interested? Look, here's the recording.